Have you ever faced a challenge so big, so overwhelming, that it felt impossible to overcome? Maybe it's a problem at work, a struggle in your relationships, or even a fear that keeps you up at night. We all have our giants, those obstacles that seem too powerful, too intimidating to face on our own. Tonight, we're going to explore one of the most inspiring stories in the Bible, a story that reminds us that no giant is too big when we have faith. This is the story of David and Goliath, a tale of courage, trust, and the incredible power of believing in something greater than ourselves. It's a story set on a battlefield, where a young shepherd boy faced a fearsome giant armed with nothing but a sling, 5 smooth stones, and an unshakable faith in God. But this isn't just a story about a fight. It's a story about overcoming fear, defying the odds, and discovering that true strength doesn't come from size or weapons, but from the heart. So, as we settle in tonight, let's journey back to a time when the Israelites stood trembling before a giant, and a young boy named David stepped forward to change everything. This is a story for anyone who's ever felt small, unprepared, or outmatched, because sometimes the smallest steps of faith can lead to the greatest victories. Let's begin with Chapter 1, The Giant's Challenge. Our story begins in the valley of Elah, a quiet, sunlit stretch of land nestled between 2 hills. On one side, the army of Israel stood ready, their banners fluttering in the breeze. On the other side, the Philistines, a fierce and formidable enemy, prepared for battle. But this was no ordinary war. For 40 days, the 2 armies had faced each other, not in combat, but in a tense, uneasy standstill. And then he appeared. From the Philistine camp emerged a figure so massive, so terrifying, that the very ground seemed to tremble beneath his feet. His name was Goliath, a warrior over 9 feet tall, clad in heavy armor that shimmered like the sun. His spear was like a weaver's beam, and his voice thundered across the valley, striking fear into the hearts of all who heard it. Every morning and evening, Goliath would stride into the valley and shout his challenge to the Israelites. "Choose a man to fight me. If he wins and kills me, we will become your slaves. But if I win and kill him, you will become our slaves." The Israelites were paralyzed with fear. King Saul, their leader, was a tall and mighty man, but even he dared not face Goliath. The giant's taunts echoed in their ears, and his shadow loomed large over their camp. Day after day, the challenge went unanswered. But in the midst of this fear, something extraordinary was about to happen. A young shepherd boy named David was on his way to the battlefield, not to fight, but to deliver food to his brothers. Little did he know, he was about to step into one of the most defining moments in history. But that's a story for the next chapter. For now, let's sit with this image, a giant towering over a valley, his voice echoing across the hills, and an army trembling in fear. It's a reminder that sometimes the challenges we face can feel just as overwhelming, just as impossible. But as we'll soon see, no giant is too big when faith enters the picture. While the armies of Israel trembled before Goliath, a young shepherd boy was going about his daily work in the fields near Bethlehem. His name was David, the youngest son of Jesse, a man of humble means. David wasn't a soldier. He wasn't trained for battle. He was a shepherd, spending his days watching over his father's sheep, playing his harp, and writing songs of praise to God. But David was no ordinary shepherd. He had a heart full of faith and a spirit that trusted completely in the Lord. He had faced danger before. Lions and bears had attacked his flock, but David had stood his ground, relying on God's strength to protect him. Those experiences had shaped him, teaching him that no challenge was too great when God was on his side. One day, David's father sent him on an errand. "Take some food to your brothers," Jesse said. see how they're doing in the camp, and bring back news." So David set out, carrying bread and cheese for his brothers, unaware that this simple task would change his life and the course of history. When David arrived at the Israelite camp, he heard it, the booming voice of Goliath, echoing across the valley. The giant was issuing his daily challenge, and the Israelite soldiers were cowering in fear. David couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Who is this Philistine?" he asked, "that he should defy the armies of the living God?" David's words were bold, but they came from a place of deep faith. While others saw a giant, David saw an enemy of God. While others felt fear, David felt indignation. How could this man mock the Lord and his people? David's brothers scolded him for speaking out of turn. "What are you doing here?" they asked. "You're just a shepherd. Go back to your sheep." But David couldn't ignore what he had seen. He knew that God was greater than any giant, and he was determined to do something about it. Word of David's boldness reached King Saul, who summoned the young shepherd to his tent. When David stood before the king, he didn't boast about his own strength or skill. Instead, he spoke of God's faithfulness. "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine," David said. Saul was moved by David's confidence, but he was still skeptical. "You're just a boy," he said. "How can you fight this seasoned warrior?" But David's faith was unshakable. He didn't need armor or weapons. He didn't need the approval of others. All he needed was his trust in God. And so, with nothing but a sling and 5 smooth stones, David prepared to face the giant. But before we see how that battle unfolds, let's pause here and reflect on David's faith. In a world full of fear and doubt, David stood firm. He didn't see himself as too small or too weak. He saw himself as a child of God, equipped with everything he needed to face the challenge before him. What giants are you facing today? And like David, do you believe that God is bigger than any obstacle in your path? David's faith had caught the attention of King Saul, but the king was still unsure. How could this young shepherd, with no armor and no training, possibly defeat a giant like Goliath? Saul looked at David and said, "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David's confidence didn't come from his own strength or experience. It came from his trust in God. He replied to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul was moved by David's words. He saw the fire of faith in the young shepherd's eyes and finally agreed to let him face Goliath. But first, he offered David his own armor, a bronze helmet, a coat of mail, and a sword. Saul wanted to give David every advantage, but David knew that this battle wasn't about human strength or weapons. It was about trusting in God's power. David tried on the armor, but it was heavy and awkward. He wasn't used to wearing such things. "I cannot go in these," he said, "because I'm not used to them." So he took them off and chose instead to face Goliath with the tools he knew best: a simple shepherd's sling and 5 smooth stones he picked up from a nearby stream. These stones weren't just ordinary rocks. They were symbols of David's faith. Each one represented his trust in God's provision, his belief that the Lord would guide his hand and give him victory. David didn't need an army or a sword. He didn't need to look like a warrior. All he needed was his faith and the knowledge that God was with him. As David walked toward the battlefield, the Israelite soldiers watched in awe. Some may have thought he was foolish. Others may have doubted his chances. But David didn't let their skepticism shake him. He walked with purpose, his heart steady, his mind focused on the Lord. This moment reminds us that sometimes the tools God gives us don't look impressive to the world. They may seem small, simple, or inadequate. But when we trust in God, Even the smallest things can become powerful instruments of his will. David's preparation wasn't about gathering weapons or armor. It was about preparing his heart. He knew that this battle wasn't his to win, it was God's. And with that assurance, he stepped forward to face the giant. But before we see what happens next, let's take a moment to reflect. What battles are you preparing for in your own life? Are you relying on your own strength? Or are you trusting in God's power to guide you? Sometimes, the greatest victories come when we let go of what the world tells us we need and simply trust in the Lord. The moment had come. David stood at the edge of the valley, his sling in one hand and 5 smooth stones in the other. Across from him loomed Goliath, towering over the landscape like a mountain. The giant's armor gleamed in the sunlight, and his spear looked like a tree trunk in his massive hands. As David approached, Goliath sneered. He looked at the young shepherd and laughed, a deep, mocking laugh that echoed across the valley. "Am I a dog?" Goliath roared. "That you come at me with sticks?" He cursed David by his gods and shouted, "Come here, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." But David didn't flinch. He didn't cower or retreat. Instead, he stood tall and spoke with a confidence that could only come from faith. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin," David said, "but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." The words hung in the air, charged with power. Goliath, enraged, began to move toward David, his heavy footsteps shaking the ground. David, calm and focused, reached into his bag, took out a single stone, and placed it in his sling. The two armies watched in silence, holding their breath. The Philistines were confident in their champion. The Israelites were praying for a miracle. And David, he was trusting in the Lord. With a practiced hand, David swung the sling and let the stone fly. It soared through the air, straight and true, striking Goliath in the forehead. The giant staggered, his eyes wide with shock, and then he fell face down on the ground. The earth seemed to tremble as his massive body hit the dirt. David ran to Goliath, took the giant's own sword, and cut off his head. The Philistines, who had been so confident moments before, now panicked. Their champion was dead, and their courage melted away. They turned and fled, with the Israelites chasing after them in victory. It was a moment no one could have predicted. A young shepherd, armed with nothing but a sling and a stone, had defeated a giant. But this wasn't just David's victory, it was God's. David had trusted in the Lord, and God had delivered him. David's victory over Goliath was more than just a triumph on the battlefield. It was a testament to the power of faith, the strength of courage, and the truth that no challenge is too great when we trust in God. As we reflect on this incredible story, let's take a moment to uncover the lessons it holds for us today. First, faith overcomes fear. When everyone else was paralyzed by Goliath's size and strength, David saw the giant through the lens of faith. He didn't focus on what he lacked. He focused on what God could do. David's confidence wasn't in himself, but in the Lord. And because of that, he was able to step forward when others stepped back. Second, God often uses the unlikely. David was the youngest in his family, a shepherd with no military training. By the world's standards, he was the least qualified to face Goliath. But God doesn't look at outward appearances or human qualifications. He looks at the heart. David's faith and willingness to trust God made him the perfect instrument for this moment. Third, true strength comes from God. David didn't rely on Saul's armor or his own abilities. He relied on the Lord. His sling and stones were simple tools, but in God's hands, they were more than enough. This reminds us that we don't have to face our battles alone. When we lean on God's strength, Even our weaknesses can become sources of power. Finally, the battle is the Lord's. David declared this truth before he even faced Goliath. He knew that the victory wasn't his to win, it was God's. And the same is true for us. When we surrender our struggles to God and trust Him to fight for us, we can face even the most daunting challenges with peace and confidence. So, what giants are you facing today? Maybe it's a problem at work, a difficult relationship, or a fear that keeps you up at night. Whatever it is, remember David's story. Remember that no giant is too big for God. When we step forward in faith, trusting in His strength and His promises, we can overcome anything. As we close this chapter, let's carry this truth with us. With God, all things are possible. And so, we come to the end of our journey through the story of David and Goliath. It's a story that reminds us of the power of faith, the strength of courage, and the truth that no giant is too big for God. As you close your eyes tonight, I invite you to think about the giants in your own life. What challenges are you facing? What fears are holding you back? Remember David's example. Remember that you don't have to face these battles alone. God is with you, ready to guide you, strengthen you, and give you victory. Take a deep breath and let go of your worries. Trust in the Lord, just as David did. Know that He is greater than any obstacle, any fear, any giant. And as you rest tonight, may you feel His peace surrounding you, reminding you that you are never alone. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Sleeping with the Bible. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. And if you have a favorite Bible story you'd like me to share in the future, let me know. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with peace, your heart with faith, and your spirit with the assurance that God is always by your side. Good night and sleep well.